Mm.
Okay, I think we are recording.
Good.
Robert, thank you so much for agreeing to have this conversation with me today. So the topic is one that approaches the ethical dilemmas that lawyers face. And in your case, really, I'm looking for your input as a barrister. So
Good.
you've led such an illustrious and at times provocative career. You've defended a wide variety of clients, from serious cases to what can be described as white-collar crimes. Many of your clients are considered controversial, and some even share the added burden of presumed guilty in the public domain, such as the recent case with involving Cardinal Pell. What draws you to these cases from both a professional and a personal point of view?
What draws me to them is if I'm offered them, because I can't decide the cases that I want to do. I don't pick and choose. I can't pick and choose in the usual way. But what draws me to them when a case arises which presents issues such as the one that Cardinal Pell was facing, or someone who's charged with a murder who has a reputation for being part of a gang, or even a little 17-year-old kid who's preparing bombs, theoretically, and is charged with terrorism offences. But what draws me to them is the notion that whoever it is has to have their fair chance of an acquittal. They have to invoke that which the law guarantees them, which is due process and a proper consideration of evidence, not of what they've heard or read somewhere else. So that's what draws me to it, and I think it has to do with background, coming. I wasn't a refugee. My parents were refugees, but I suppose till the age of 3 I was a refugee when we went to Israel because we couldn't go anywhere else. But the background of suffering of my family, my parents, grandparents, and all the rest of it, I think induced a sense that justice is one of the supreme qualities that need to be observed and applied in this community. So I'm drawn to refugees who are seeking help. I'm drawn to people who appear to be banged up by a system and improperly. And I might add that also means that if there is if it's not a trial, most of the cases result in pleas of guilty and the plea to try and get a decent sentence rather than try and get a verdict not guilty. And in those instances, we are trying to get a decent sentence. The important thing that I look at is the notion of how do you personalise an accused prisoner who's pleaded guilty? How do you explain their life in a way that to a judge makes some sense other than just saying this is a vile and horrible act and you're going to get a huge sentence, and pays lip service to things like a plea of guilty, the notions of remorse and so on. And there are some cases where it matters, some cases where it's put aside, but the principal work of an advocate is to say that which the client would like to have said had they had the legal training. So what draws me is just the notion that we're here to try and achieve a just result.
Wow, thank you. You did mention the cab rule, which was another question I was going to ask you. Of course, you don't have the opportunity to reject certain cases, but do you think that this cab rule in the barristers' rules, do you think that in some ways, because of that rule, that barristers are perhaps held to a higher standard than solicitors because you are able to reject cases?
I think it is. I think it is. Barristers theoretically with the cab-rank principle, are not allowed to reject cases just because they don't like the person or they don't like the charges. So the cab-rank principle is a very, very important principle. I might add that in my experience, it has been honoured in the breach a number of times by barristers who will find an excuse not to. It's not even usually an ethical objection. From time to time, there will be a situation where someone has accepted a brief, is preparing for it. It's a one-day plea, or it's a 2-day, 3-day hearing, or whatever, and they get offered a really fat brief that will keep them occupied for weeks. And theoretically, they should adhere to the first brief that they accepted. But, you know, people are human, including barristers, and some will say, oh, God, look, I better find some way out of this one.
Wow.
So
okay.
That happens at the bar from time to time. It's not something that we like to think of, but it does happen from time to time because it involves significant personal sacrifice also. If you've offered a really lucrative brief, but you're doing a legal aid plea or something, the temptation to say, well, how the hell can I get out of that legal aid plea so I can do the other one? The temptation is there. But at least in principle, you're obliged to adhere to the first brief that you've accepted. We try to observe that when we can. And solicitors, on the other hand, are not bound by that. But if they undertake an engagement, they can withdraw. But, you know, they will assess cases as to whether or not it's going to be good for them and accept or reject the cases, and they're free to do so. So the cab-rank principle is very, very important, I think, for two reasons. One is that people are entitled to be represented by people they want to brief, and the other one is that people who have unpopular causes are obliged to accept the brief unless it is professionally embarrassing. I've only had one of those in my entire criminal defence history, where I have rejected a brief on the basis that I found embarrassment in the sense of a conflict of interest, other than that there are other parties involved. But it was one in which I chose not to do it because whichever way I went, it would be disastrous. You know, if I succeeded, I would be vindicating the person who was anathema to me, and if I was convicted, I would be accused of having conspired to defeat that person. Neither of those would apply, in fact, but the perception would be, and the representation would be, that you know, if I got someone off who was a Nazi or whatever, I can expect to be criticised. I don't mind. I've acted for Nazis.
Wow.
Yes, but in a particular case where it's a particular Nazi kind of person accused who claims that it's all a Jewish conspiracy, I find that there's conflict of interest in someone who is a Jew, albeit an atheist Jew, defending the case, because if you win the case, you are vindicating the conspiracy. If you lose the case, you're part of the conspiracy to blame someone and put them down. So in that, some sort of cases, you can have a conflict of ethical principle. But as I say, I've only come across one case where that has caused me to reject the brief. And that's after practicing since 1971. So it's a rare thing. And not do it because you like the person or dislike the person. You do it because each person is entitled to justice.
But you did say that, you know, we're all human. So do you feel that somebody might potentially a barrister who might be experiencing a conflict, an internal conflict, might just subconsciously not be able to defend a client as well as he or she would like to?
Well, the answer to that is it's not really subconsciously. I mean, you do have your likes and dislikes, and you know that.
Mm,
And providing you tell the client that, I mean, you can put it to the client on the basis of, listen, I have very strong feelings about this. For example, if you want to prosecute someone, and I have had prosecutions, but if you want to prosecute, you're trying to prosecute someone for crimes that you consider are immoral crimes. A lot of our drug cases are that. If you're asked to prosecute such a case, and you tell those instructing you to prosecute that you have strong moral objections to the law, and that you don't know that you'd be able to do a good job in the usual way, because you can't get those strong moral objections out of your system in an unconscious way. You can do it consciously,
sure.
but you find that having said that to solicitors over the years in certain types of cases, they'll say, well, we understand, we'll brief someone who's not as conflicted.
Sure.
Which is terrific.
So as important as you've said, and I agree with you about the cab rank rule, do you think that there is any room for change or amendments when it comes to that, to bring into account that barristers are also human, and not to force them, I guess force might be a little bit strong a word, but to take them a case that they don't want to take?
It doesn't really arise. It doesn't really arise, because ultimately,
Mm-hmm.
if you have a case that makes you feel such feelings of revulsion towards the client, not towards the crime, but towards the client,
Yep.
you can say that you are emotionally conflicted to the stage where you don't think you'd be able to do as good a job for the client as they deserve, whatever the feelings are. And as long as you've disclosed that, if the person says, no, but I want you to do it, that's fine. You do it. I remember I had one case where I was defending someone in a conspiracy case who came in a meat substitution racket who asked me to defend him, and that was years ago. And by the time we'd got well into the case, there was some listening device recordings played that I hadn't come across, and one of them was my client conducting a birthday party for Hitler.
Wow. Sorry for my reaction there. That was...
And I'm listening to it, and I asked him about it. So, I don't mean that. It didn't matter, because I said, look, I don't condone that, but it has nothing to do with the charges with which you're charged. So, as long as you know that I hate Nazis, I'll do it. And he said, please do. And I did.
Interesting. Following on from exactly what you just said about your duties to your client, as barristers and lawyers in general, our paramount duty is to the administration of justice. You've already explained that that's one of the reasons why you agree so much with the cab rank rule, that everybody is entitled to a good defense, and what we're looking for is justice rather than a win or a lose. So have there ever been other examples of when you might have felt conflicted between your duty to the administration of justice and the courts and your client?
No, not really, apart from those things that I've already mentioned. Not really. It hasn't happened. And the reason it hasn't happened is because the first requirement is that you do a professional job. And as a professional, you distance yourself, or you try to distance yourself. If you find it impossible to distance yourself, then you opt out. because you don't think you can do the right kind of job. I opted out of having a direct involvement in the Pell appeals because I was too emotionally involved, and I put that right up front.
Yes, and I actually wanted to discuss
very
that.
glad, and I'm very glad that I did that, because I think it would have taken the kind of toll on my life that at my age I don't think I could have sustained.
Right, I understand. Well, yes, as you said, you did take on initially to be part of the defence team for Cardinal.
Oh, I did the committal. I did the 2 trials.
Thing. Yeah.
That we should have won. There was no way we could have lost. But the jury, having come back with a guilty verdict, which was perverse, I just couldn't deal with that. And if you can't live with something, you really can't professionally assess it in the way that you should. If somebody had, I usually give the example of a surgeon who, if somebody brings Hitler, excuse me,
No
I have to take this. You can.
Pause the recording. So, Robert, I've just restarted the recording, and I just want to follow on from what you just brought up with the Pell case. So, respectfully, there were some controversial comments that you made during the Pell. Well, actually, I think it was during the sentencing in 2019. Yeah. And I'm sure you know what those comments are.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So you probably don't need me to repeat them.
No, but I can tell you what the issue was, and it wasn't much of an issue, although it was blown up.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. So just for the record, just so I've got this recording, what you said was that the case was no more than a plain vanilla sexual penetration case where the child is not actively participating. You did later issue a written statement, an apology. Did you expect the backlash that you received?
No, because any lawyer who listened to it and understood it, and that included the judge to whom I was making the plea, would have taken it in the way. You see, you do pleas in all sorts of cases. The plain vanilla kind of expression is one which is traditionally used in fraud cases, tax frauds and the like. It means it's something without additional frills and additional sophistications and additional sort of complexities or aggravating circumstances like actual, physical violence in terms of hitting someone or doing injuring them and the like. So I've prosecuted tax conspiracies, for example, which have been what I might have described and would have, and a lot of lawyers describe those as, oh, that's a plain vanilla deferment or this or that. Or in other words, it's a simple case in terms of what was done without the additional frills of concealment of this and forging documents and the like. So, and when you transpose it to another case of somebody shooting somebody, let's say, and you say, well, it's plain vanilla shooting. Or you might say it, and the judge, the prosecutor, and anyone listening who knows what the case is about would say, oh, yes, what he means is, well, he shot the man. It's not like he bit into a pulp. It's not like after the shooting he kicked the body and dismembered it. It's not, you follow?
I do understand, yes, but Cardinal Pell had maintained his innocence.
But, of course.
Excuse me.
Of course, but the whole plea is predicated on the basis that he has been convicted. So you have to take that as a given.
Got it.
And
okay.
Taking it as a given, you take whatever issues you can to minimize the sentence. And some of the issues are, I mean, you're not entitled to a sentencing discount because you pleaded not guilty. You're not entitled to a discount because you've been remorseful, because you're not. And that's all made clear to the sentencing judge. And the sentencing comments of the judge don't mean that he accepts the horrible things that were said. It means that he must accept them and act on them. So when you're trying to get a sentence fixed, it's in the context of, well, we don't admit guilt, never did. We still maintain our innocence. But having been found guilty by a jury of X, you have to put X into a context of anything that might assist in getting a sentence that is lower than might otherwise be. I mean, if you were just to stand up and say, well, yes, there's no remorse, there's no plea of guilty, the acts that were done were disgusting, you have to accept all that. But then you can talk in terms of the person's background, what brought them to do what they did. And it's not on the basis that they did it, but it's on the basis that they were found to have done it. So you have to accept the jury's verdict when you're making the plea, but within that, you have to maneuver it in a way that as best you can to try and minimize the sentence, albeit that it is a sentence of someone who's been convicted. So you can understand that you're becoming schizophrenic, but you have to do it in a schizoid setting of saying to the judge, look, he maintains his innocence. You're going to say he did X, Y, Z, and I have to accept that because that's what the jury found. And having accepted that, you explain and you put the person in context as best you can so that they're not just this evil monster who's done something and has been doing it all his life or whatever. And so the plain vanilla comment came as indicating that this was not a situation in which it was alleged that, for example, Pell threatened the children and said something like, don't tell anyone, or you'll be in terrible trouble. He never supposed to have said anything of the kind. It's not something where if a kid is whimpering and is not happy about what happens, you slap them across the face and you say, you do what you're bloody well told, that kind of stuff. See, all those things are aggravating circumstances. What you're saying is a plain vanilla case. What you're effectively saying is there's no aggravating circumstances.
We've just started the recording again, and I just want to follow on from what you have just explained, I think very clearly about what you meant by the vanilla comment. And I accept everything that you've said. My question is, why then did you apologize?
Because it was taken in a way to be insulting to people, to alleged victims or to proven victims. It was taken to be insulting. It was never meant to be insulting. It was meant to be a kind of logical, professional dissection of what the case was about.
Right.
So it was a bad choice of words, because when you're talking about plain vanilla in the context of a text case, when someone is supposed to be sucking somebody's penis or made to suck someone's penis, it can be taken as a blowout kind of appalling bad taste.
Sure,
you know?
of course.
And that's what it was, and that's why I apologized. But I wasn't apologizing for what was intended in terms of what was being said. I was apologizing for my choice of words that were really inappropriate there in context because of what the allegation was, that of putting a penis in someone's mouth. So, the notion of vanilla and an ice cream and so on would have really caused enormous outrage. That's why I apologised for it.
And is that one of the reasons why you excused yourself from the appeal?
No, no. I excused myself from the appeal because I was angry about the fact that I thought we had a perverse jury, and I just felt that, you know, I didn't have enough objectivity to do it as dispassionately as it should have been done, which it was by Brett Walker,
Yes.
who was an appellate lawyer. I used to be an appellate lawyer in earlier years. I used to do tons of appeals, but then I became a trial lawyer rather than an appellate lawyer. I would do appeals now and then, but not as a day-to-day thing. So there was nothing that precluded me or stopped me from wanting to do it, other than the knowledge that I would want to be extremely objective. I'll ring him later.
Thank you. I won't take up too much more of your time, but I guess the final couple of questions are about, let me ask you this. Have you ever taken on, I'm not sure whether or not you can answer this, but have you ever been working with a client that you thought was guilty?
Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly.
Does
And
it
if he said to me, and if the client said to me, I'm guilty, I would ask, what does that mean? You shot the person, yes, and that doesn't necessarily make you feel guilty. What did you intend to do, etc., etc. If the client says, you know, I shot him, I intended to kill him, and it wasn't in self-defense and whatnot, and you explore all that, then you know, you cannot call the client to say I didn't do it. But yes, you can defend someone who you think is guilty, although you try very hard not to be the judge. There are certain things you need to know, but your job is not to judge the client, whatever you might think. And you get to the stage where you don't judge the client. You may have thoughts about, oh, probably guilty or whatever, but if the client is not asking you to propound a lie, not allowed to do, and I won't, and people shouldn't and mustn't do it, to plead not guilty is effectively saying to the other side, you prove it.
So,
but you cannot lie. It's not a question of lying, because you don't lie, you do your job.
I think that there's a fine line there between ethics and how you view ethics then, if you're willing to defend a client that you think is guilty?
I don't think it's an impediment. First of all, if you think they're guilty, that's your thinking as a judge. You don't think about that. You shouldn't think about that. You should think about the evidence and whether it's sufficient to establish guilt without calling the person to give false evidence. You know, as if the thing is stuffed up by the prosecution, which it is from time to time, the law says you're entitled to insist that the case be proved properly.
It seems very clear when it comes to
clear distinction, and I've never had trouble with it.
That's wonderful.
Because the client has never said to me, I shot him, but I'm going to say that I wasn't even there. And you push the line that says, but he wasn't even there. You can't. You can cross-examine a witness who gives identification evidence saying, I saw this with this person and I identify this person as such and such. You're entitled to run a voir dire to examine whether the identification evidence is admissible. And if it's not admissible and gets knocked out and you've got no one identifying the person gets acquitted. But it's not because you've called the person to say it wasn't me.
I understand.
So there are very clear distinctions that have to be borne in mind, always.
Thank you, Robert. Just as a final question, and then I'd love your final insights on the ethical dilemmas that sometimes law students have. But do you have any opinions on Lawyer X?
I think what Lawyer X did was completely shameful, in breach of every ethical principle that is known to the law. She was in our chambers for a number of years, between 2005 and 2009. I've not had her as a junior in many cases. She was involved in one of my cases. I defended a man called Farouk Woman on a charge of murder, and she did some work. It was only later, years later, that we discovered that she had been wording up the main witness against him to create evidence. And once that was uncovered in what became the Royal Commission into the witness, his conviction was quashed.
Mm-hmm.
But apart from that, I've not done much work with her, but the notion that such an obvious conflicted situation would arise where she's acting for one client and then persuading another client to give false evidence against him, that was horrendous. The High Court found so. I mean, it wasn't even a question of a judgment of an ethical principle, because the ethics were clear, and were flouted in the most flagrant way.
Mm-hmm. Robert, thank you so much for everything that you've shared. It's certainly been very insightful to me, because as you and I have discussed, there's been certain areas that I have been internally conflicted about, but I feel like, because I do feel like sometimes, or at least I did before our conversation, I have felt that at times ethics can be quite grey. But having spoken with you, and as a barrister that's so experienced, I think it's really important that that we as students learn what it's really like. And so I guess as a final question, as law students, we're taught that, you know, our personal beliefs shouldn't influence our work. But it's very difficult to separate Robert the barrister, or Q the law student, and hopefully barrister one day, to the person that you are.
It's the sort of thing that everyone's mother asks their son who's a lawyer, or their daughter who's a barrister: how can you defend somebody who's guilty? Well,
sure.
It's called professionalism, and the example that I always give to people who question it is this: somebody brings Adolf Hitler into my surgery. I'm a surgeon, and he's got a bullet wound which is going to kill him, and there he is. I, as a surgeon, would then do an operation as well as I could, remove the bullet, sew him up, and then take a gun and shoot him and kill him successfully. You see, I mean, that's the distinction between being a professional and being also human and having feelings.
Of course,
you know?
Of course. I think that that's a wonderful statement to end on. Thank you so much for your time, Robert, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you.